We are reading The Hobbit. I am about, if you're an avid reader, you kind of mark your books by how much you read. So we are about here. We're on page 73. And I've come across the first couple of sad moments. They've lost the ponies to the goblins, and but Gandalf rescued them with the sword from the elves called Glamdring, the foe hammer. He killed the great Goblin King, and now he's rescued his friends, but they are in the mountain, like in the heart of the mountain. And some of the interesting things that kind of prepares you is that goblins in this story can kind of split the mountain and arrive when you least expect it, when you think that the way is safe. Okay, so Gandalf is saying, and I'm on page 73, and about the middle, I highlighted this, I annotated this for love and loyalty, and this for sadness. This was an excellent description of how horrible something would be if you can't envision how horrible the shrieking was. The description of several things dying at once and how that makes you feel is a great description to help you understand. And also something that I wanted to notice, there have been a few studies, you can look them up, that said that listening to a story is just the same as you reading it yourself. What matters most is how you best like to have a story. So if you like to have the story read to you, then that is how you will kind of interpret the story. If you like to do the reading, then that is how you should learn about the story. So 73, it says, "Are we all here?" said he, handing his sword back to Thorin with a bow. "Let me see. 1, that's Thorin. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where are Feely and Keely? Here they are, 12 and 13. And here's Mr. Baggins, 14. Well, well, it might be worse. And then again, it might be a good deal better. No ponies and no food and no knowing quite where we are, and hordes of angry goblins just behind. On we go." On they went. Gandalf was quite right. They began to hear goblin noises and horrible cries far behind in the passages they had come through. It's almost like they're in a great giant maze, and they have to navigate the maze, but the goblins can split the mountain and create new passages. That sent them on faster than ever, and as poor Bilbo could not possibly go half as fast, for dwarves can roll along at a tremendous pace, I can tell you, when they have to, they took it in turn to carry him on their backs. Still, goblins go faster than dwarves, and these goblins knew the way better. They had made the pass themselves, and they were madly angry. So that do what they could, the dwarves heard the cries and howls getting closer and closer. Soon they could even hear the flap of the goblin feet, many, many feet, which seemed only just round the last corner. The blink of red torches could be seen behind them in the tunnel they were following, and they were getting deadly tired. "Why, oh, why did I ever leave my hobbit hole?" said poor Mr. Baggins, bumping up and down on Bormer's back. "Why, oh, why did I ever bring a wretched little hobbit on a treasure hunt?" said poor Boromir, who was fat and staggered along with sweat dripping down his nose in his heat and terror. At this point, Gandalf fell behind, and Thorin with him. They turned a sharp corner. "About turn," he shouted. "Draw your sword, Thorin." There was nothing else to be done, and the goblins did not like it. They came scurrying round the corner in full cry and found goblin cleaver and foe hammer shining cold and bright right in their astonished eyes. The ones in front dropped their torches and gave one yell before they were killed. The ones behind yelled still more. and leaped back, knocking over those that were running after them. Biter and beater, they shrieked. And soon they were all in confusion, and most of them were hustling back in the way they had come. It was quite a long time before any of them dared to turn that corner. By that time, the dwarves had gone on again, a long, long way on into the dark tunnels of the goblins' realm. When the goblins discovered that, they put out their torches, and they slipped on soft shoes, and they chose their very quickest runners with the sharpest ears and eyes. These ran forward as swift as weasels in the dark, with hardly any more noise than bats. That is why neither Bilbo nor the dwarves, nor even Gandalf, heard them coming, nor did they see them, but they were seen by the goblins that ran silently up behind, for Gandalf was letting his wand give out a faint light to help the dwarves as they went along. Quite suddenly, Dory, now at the back again, carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind in the dark. He shouted and fell, and the hobbit rolled off his shoulders into the blackness, bumped his head on hard rock, and remembered nothing more. And that's the end of that chapter. That was the chapter 4 called Over Hill and Under Hill. So now we're on to chapter 5 that says Riddles in the Dark. We're only 6 minutes into our 20 minutes. If you want to take a break, ends of chapters are great places to take a break. But here we go, Riddles in the Dark. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark with them shut. No one was anywhere near him. Just imagine his fright. He could hear nothing, see nothing, and he could feel nothing except the stone of the floor. Very slowly, he got up and groped about on all fours till he touched the wall of the tunnel. But neither up nor down he could find anything. Nothing at all. No sign of goblins, no sign of dwarves. His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even of the direction they had been going in when he had his fall. That's a terrifying feeling, to not know where you are, how far you are, and have no one to guide you whatsoever. So you can apply that to moments in your lives when you are completely and utterly lost without a plan. And what do you do next? Very slowly. Okay, so no sign of anybody. His head was swimming. He guessed as well as he could and crawled along for a good way till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. What he has found. He put the ring, in his pocket, almost without thinking. Certainly, it did not seem of any particular use at the moment. He did not go much further, but sat on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness for a long while. He thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside that it was high time for some meal or another, but that only made him miserabler. He could not think what to do, nor could he think what had happened, or why he had been left behind, or why, if he had been left behind, the goblins had not caught him, or even why his head was so sore. The truth was, he had been lying quiet and out of sight and out of mind in a very dark corner for a long while. After some time, he felt for his pipe. It was not broken, and that was something. Then he felt for his pouch, and there was some tobacco in it, and that was something more. Then he felt for matches, and he could not find any at all, and that shattered his hopes completely. Just as well for him as he had agreed when he came to his senses. Goodness knows what the striking of matches and the smell of tobacco would have brought on him out of dark holes in that horrible place. Still, at the moment, he felt very crushed. But in slapping all his pockets and feeling all around himself for matches, his hand came on the hilt of his little sword. the little dagger that he got from the trolls, and that he had quite forgotten, nor do the goblins seem to have noticed it, as he wore it inside his breeches. Now he drew it out. It shone pale and dim before his eyes. So it is an elvish blade, too, he thought, and goblins are not very near, and yet not far enough. Because remember, all their swords glow if goblins are around. But somehow he was comforted. It was rather splendid to be wearing a blade made in Gondolin for the goblin wars of which so many songs had sung, and also he had noticed that such weapons made a great impression on goblins that came upon them suddenly. Go back, he thought, no good at all. Go sideways? Impossible. Go forward? Only one thing to do. On we go. So up he got, and trotted along with his little sword held in front of him, and one hand feeling the wall, and his heart all of a pitter and patter. Now certainly Bilbo was in what is called a tight place, but you must remember it was not quite so tight for him as it would have been for me or you. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people, and after all, if their holes are nice, cheery places and properly aired, quite different from the tunnels of the goblins, still they are more used to tunneling than we are, and they do not easily lose their sense of direction underground, not when their heads have recovered from being bumped. So, once again, what you should take from that is to draw upon what strengths and experiences you have when you are in a tight place, even if it is something so small and seemingly he's in an impossible place, but he is thinking through one thing and one thing and one thing. Also, they can move very quietly and hide easily and recover wonderfully from falls and bruises. And they have a fund of wisdom and wise sayings that men have mostly never heard or have forgotten long ago. How wonderful it would be if we could recover wonderfully from falls and bruises, or maybe tell ourselves that. I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggins' place, all the same. The tunnel seemed to have no end. All he knew was that it was still going down pretty steadily and keeping in the same direction in spite of a twist and a turn or two. There were passages leading off to the side every now and then, as he knew by the glimmer of his sword, or could feel with his hand on the wall. Of these he took no notice, except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. On he went, and down, and still he heard no sound of anything, except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first, till it became too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop. On until he was tireder and then tired. I heard something recently, and it was from a Ted Lasso episode, and it said, the dark forest is never the beginning of the story. It is always smack dab in the middle, and why would you stop in the dark forest? Because the beginning of the story is bright, and the end of the story is bright. So this is Bilbo's dark forest. One of them, maybe. Okay. So it seemed like all the way to tomorrow and over it to the days beyond. Suddenly, without any warning, he trotted splash into water. Ugh, it was icy cold. That pulled him up, sharp and short. He did not know whether it was just a pool in the path, or the edge of an underground stream that crossed the passage, or the brink of a deep, dark subterranean lake. The sword was hardly shining at all. He stopped, and he could hear, when he listened, hard drops, drip, drip, dripping. from an unseen roof into the water below, but there seemed no other sort of sound. So is it a pool or a lake and not an underground river, he thought. Still, he did not dare to wade out into the darkness. He could not swim. And he thought, too, of nasty, slimy things with big, bulging, blind eyes wriggling in the water. There are strange things living in the pools and lakes in the hearts of mountains. Fish whose fathers swam in, goodness knows how many years ago, and never swam out again, while their eyes grew bigger and bigger and bigger from trying to see in the blackness. Also, there are other things more slimy than fish. Even in the tunnels and caves the goblins have made for themselves, there are other things living unbeknown to them that have sneaked in from the outside to lie up in the dark. Some of these caves, too, go back in their beginnings to ages before the goblins, who only widened them and joined them up with passages, and the original owners are still there in odd corners, slinking and nosing about. Deep down here by the dark water lived old Gollum, a small, slimy creature. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. He was Gollum, as dark as darkness, except for two big, round, pale eyes in his thin face. He had a little boat, and he had rowed about quite quietly on the lake, for lake it was, wide and deep and deadly cold. He paddled it with large feet dangling over the side, but never a ripple did he make, not he. He was looking out of his pale, lamp-like eyes for blind fish, which he grabbed with his long fingers as quick as thinking. He liked meat, too. Goblin he thought good when he could get it, but he took care they never found him out. He just throttled them from behind if they ever came down alone anywhere near the edge of the water while he prowled about. They very seldom did, for they had a feeling that something unpleasant was lurking down there, down at the very roots of the mountain. So this is Gollum, and this is his lake, and we know a little bit about him if you've watched Lord of the Rings. And then you know about what Bilbo has found. They had come on the lake when they were tunneling down long ago, and they found they could go no further. So there their road ended in that direction, and there was no reason to go that way, unless the great goblin sent them. Sometimes he took a fancy for fish from the lake, and sometimes neither goblin nor fish came back. Actually, Gollum lived on a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He was watching Bilbo now from the distance with his pale eyes like telescopes. Bilbo could not see him, but he was wondering a lot about Bilbo, for he could see that he was no goblin at all. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island, while Bilbo was sitting on the brink altogether flummoxed, and at the end of his way and his wits. Suddenly up came Gollum and whispered and hissed, "Bless us and splash us, my preciousness. I guess it's a choice feast. At least a tasty morsel it'd make us, Gollum." And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat. That is how he got his name, though he always called himself my precious. The Hobbit nearly jumped out of his skin when the hiss came in his ears, and he suddenly saw the pale eyes sticking out at him. "Who are you?" he said, thrusting his dagger in front of him. "What is he, my precious?" whispered Gollum, who always spoke to himself, though never having anyone else to speak to. So he's kind of gone mad, almost like Castaway and Wilson. He's talking to himself because he's the only one. This is what he had come to find out, for he was not really very hungry at the moment. Only curious. Otherwise, he would have grabbed first and whispered afterwards. I am Mr. Bilbo Baggins. I have lost the dwarves, and I have lost the wizard, and I don't know where I am, and I don't want to know, if only I can get away. What's he got in his handses? Said Gollum, looking at the sword, which he did not quite like. A sword, a blade, come out of Gondolin, said Gollum, and became quite polite. Perhaps ye sits here and chats with it a bitsy, my precious. It likes riddles, perhaps it does it? He was anxious to appear friendly, at any rate for the moment, and until he found out more about the sword and the hobbit, whether he was quite alone really, whether he was good to eat, and whether Gollum was really hungry. Riddles were all he could think of. Asking them, and sometimes guessing them, had been the only game he had ever played with other funny creatures, sitting in their holes in the long ago, before he lost all his friends and was driven away, alone, and crept down into the dark under the mountains. Very well, said Bilbo, who was anxious to agree until he found out more about the creature, whether he was quite alone, whether he was fierce or hungry, and whether he was a friend of the goblins. You ask first, he said, because he had not had time to think of a riddle. So Gollum hissed, What has roots, as nobody sees, is taller than trees. Up it goes, and yet it never grows. Easy, said Bilbo. Mountain, I suppose. Does it guess easy? It must have a competition with us, my precious. If precious asks, and it doesn't answer, we eats it, my precious. If it asks us, and we doesn't answer, then we does what it wants, eh? We shows it the way out. Yes. All right, said Bilbo, not daring to disagree. So he's buying himself time, and nearly bursting his brain to think of riddles that could save him from being eaten. 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. That was all he could think of to ask. The idea of eating was rather on his mind. It was rather an old one, too, and Gollum knew the answer as well as you do. Chestnuts, he hissed. Teeth, my preciousness. But we has only 6. Then he asked his second. 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. And the answer is chestnuts. I'll have to work that one out. Voiceless it cries, wingless flutters, toothless bites, mouthless mutters. Half a moment, cried Bilbo, who was still thinking uncomfortably about eating. Fortunately, he had once heard something rather like this before, and getting his wits back, he thought of the answer. Wind, of course, he said, and he was so pleased that he made up one on the spot. This'll puzzle the nasty little underground creature, he thought. So the answer was wind. Voiceless it cries, wingless flutters, toothless bites, mouthless mutters. So the answer is wind. An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in low place, not in high place. Tss, 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 said Gollum. He had been underground a long time and was forgetting this sort of thing, but just as Bilbo was beginning to hope that the wretch would not be able to answer, Gollum brought up memories of ages and ages and ages before, when he lived with his grandmother in a hole in a bank by a river. Tss, 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 my precious, he said, sun on the daisies, it means it does. But these ordinary, above-ground, everyday sort of riddles were tiring for him, and they reminded him of days when he had been less lonely and sneaky and nasty, and that put him out of temper. What is more, they made him hungry. So this time he tried something a bit more difficult and more unpleasant. It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empties holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, ends life, kills laughter. Unfortunately, for Gollum, Bilbo had heard that sort of thing before, and the answer was all round him anyway. Dark, he said, without even scratching his head or putting on his thinking cap. So it cannot be seen, it cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. Oh, darkness. A box without hinges, key or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. He asked to gain time until he could think of a really hard one. This he thought a dreadly easy chestnut, though he had not asked it in the usual words, but it proved a nasty poser for Gollum. He hissed to himself, and still he did not answer. He whispered and sputtered. After some time, Bilbo became impatient. Well, what is it? He said. The answer's not a kettle, boiling over as you seem to think from the noise you are making. Give us a chance. Let it give us a chance, my precious. Well, said Bilbo, after giving him a long chance, what about your guess? But suddenly, Gollum remembered thieving from nests long ago and sitting under the riverbank teaching his grandmother to suck. Eggs, he hissed, eggs. Then he asked, alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, never drinking, all in mail, M-A-I-L, like mail you deliver, like an envelope, mail never clinking. He also, in his turn, thought this was a dreadfully easy one, because he was always thinking of the answer. But he could not remember anything better at the moment. He was so flustered by the egg question. A box without a key or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. Oh, that's an egg. All the time it was a poser for poor Bilbo, who never heard anything to do with the water, who never had anything to do with the water if he could help it. Imagine you know the answer, of course, or can guess it as easy as winking, since you are sitting comfortably at home and have not the danger of being eaten to disturb your thinking. Bilbo sat and cleared his throat once or twice, but no answer came. After a while, Gollum began to hiss with pleasure to himself. It is nice, my precious. It is juicy. It is scrumptiously crunchable. He began to peer at Bilbo out of the darkness. Have a moment, said the hobbit, shivering. I gave you a good long chance just now. It must make haste. Haste, said Gollum, beginning to climb out of his boat on the shore to get at Bilbo. But when he put his long, webby foot in the water, a fish jumped out in fright and fell at Bilbo's toes. Ugh, he said, it is cold and clammy. And so he guessed, fish, fish, he cried, it is fish. Gollum was dreadfully disappointed, but Bilbo asked another riddle as quick as ever he could, so that Gollum had to get back into his boat and think. No legs. Lay on one leg. 2 legs. Sat near on 3 legs. 4 legs. Got some. It was not really the right time for this riddle, but Bilbo was in a hurry. Gollum might have had some trouble guessing it if he had not asked it another time. As it was, talking of fish, no legs, was not very difficult, and after that the rest was easy. Fish on a little table, man at a table, sitting on a stool, the cat has the bones. That, of course, is the answer, and Gollum soon gave it. Then he thought the time had come to ask something hard and horrible. This is what he said. This thing all things devours. Birds, beast, trees, and flowers. Gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to metal, slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down. Poor Bilbo sat in the dark thinking of all the horrible names of all the giants and ogres he had ever heard told of in tales. But not one of them had done all these things. He had a great feeling that the answer was quite different, and that he ought to know it, but he could not think of it. He began to get frightened, and that is bad for thinking. Good advice. It's hard to think when you're that afraid. Gollum began to get out of his boat. He flapped into the water and paddled to the bank. Bilbo could see his eyes coming towards him. His tongue seemed to stick in his mouth. He wanted to shout out, "Give me more time, give me time." But all that came out was a sudden squeal, was "Time, time." Bilbo was saved by pure luck, for that, of course, was the answer. I've gone on to 30 minutes because we were such at a moment. I know that I want to annotate the little part where he says he began to get frightened, and that is bad for thinking, because that is a very relatable, very kind of scary moment. And I don't think we have something for a scary moment, except that scary can be kind of sad or angry. So I'll have to think about that. We will pause here. I want to know that I'm also at page 85 in the book. And we have read to that much. Good job.